Good evening. I'm Debbie Lunder, a friend of the Institute. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is a renowned scholar and longtime friend, Lyndall Gordon. Lyndall is among the preeminent scholars of T.S. Eliot's work, and that's why she's in Princeton now. Since early this month, she's been a fixture at Firestone Library, researching the collection of over 1,000 letters that Elliot wrote to Emily Hale. The letters were unsealed earlier this month. It's interesting to note that T.S. Eliot was a member here at the Institute in the fall of 1948, and during his visit, he worked on The Cocktail Party. He left in early December to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. Lyndall grew up in Cape Town, South Africa, and did her undergraduate work at the University of Cape Town. She emigrated to New York to study 19th century American literature at Columbia University, where she earned a PhD and taught. She then moved to Oxford, England, and has been affiliated with the University of Oxford for many years, first as a Rhodes Fellow at St. Hilda's College, then a lecturer at Jesus College, and returning to St. Hilda's as a fellow and tutor in English. Currently, Lyndall is a senior research fellow at St. Hilda's. Lyndall has published 7 biographies. Her subjects include Henry James, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Dickinson, Mary Wollstonecraft, Virginia Woolf, and of course, T.S. Eliot. Her biography of him is entitled The Imperfect Life of T.S. Eliot. She's also written 2 memoirs, Shared Lives and Divided Lives, Dreams of a Mother and Daughter. Her current book project is titled Elliot Among the Women and due to be published in 2022. Lyndall has received several awards and honors for her work, including the British Academy's Rosemary Crochet Prize and the Southern Arts Prize for her biography of Elliot, the Cheltenham Prize for Literature, and the James Tate Black Prize for Biography. Her biography of Emily Dickinson was shortlisted for the Duff Cooper Prize and Italy's Comiso Prize for Biography. Lyndall is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Excuse me. I'd also like to acknowledge Lyndall's husband, Simon Gordon, who's here tonight. A world-leading cell biologist, Simon is Emeritus Glaxo Wellcome Professor of Cell Pathology at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the Royal Society. Simon was my husband, Alan Ezekowitz's DPhil advisor and mentor at Oxford. We're grateful that Lyndall is taking precious time for her research to speak to the friends in the IAS community about Elliot and 5 women in his life. She will take questions after her talk. And now, please join me in welcoming Lyndall Gordon.
Oh, thank you very much, Debbie. I wanted to just preface what I'm going to say by thanking you all so very much for asking me to come here. And I wanted also to mention that in reading Eliot's letters to Emily Hale, just released in the Princeton Firestone Library, I came across a letter that Elliot wrote to her on the 26th of March, 1933, which describes an earlier visit to Princeton. He came here to lecture on a subject that Emily Hale had suggested, the Bible and English literature. And after his lecture, he was taken on a tour of Princeton and particularly admired the stained glass in the chapel. You'll be glad to hear that this man, who was very critical in these private letters as he moved around the place, had only praise for Princeton. And he said, I'm quoting, "Princeton is the most attractive of the American universities." So I wanted to thank in particular a curator from California, Judy Sahak, who has come all the way. She Emily Hale taught from 1932 to 1934 at Scripps College, California, and Judy was the curator there and has amassed a fantastic collection of Emily Hale memorabilia from that period. And she held an exhibition some time ago and went far beyond the call of duty. So thank you, Judy. She's sitting right here. I don't know if John Schema is here. Perhaps he isn't. He was the curator here. I want finally to dedicate this talk to a chair of English when I was a student at Columbia. I came here to talk to an Eliot scholar, A. Walton Litz, and he was endlessly benevolent and kind and stimulating, and I miss him very much. There's no way to tell the whole truth about a life. If we think of our own lives and we want to tell all, it would be simply impossible. But when it comes to a creative life like Eliot's, it is possible and in fact vital to see what Henry James called famously the figure in the carpet of a great oeuvre, and Eliot called the pattern. Eliot's story was in one sense simple. I'm quoting the sequence that culminates in faith. That's a phrase from his essay on Pascal. His poetry and prose and plays explore this sequence repeatedly, dramatizing the tension between the model lives of saints, burning in every moment, he says, and the imperfections of people like himself, in his case, pride, gloom, and as he mentions again and again in these newly opened letters to Emily Hale, he confesses to temper with a capital T, a violent temper, he says. There is also guilt over his treatment of certain women who entered into his life and work. Central to Eliot's spiritual search were 5 remarkable and very different women. First of all, his mother, who was the guiding light. She wrote poetry. She published it in obscure Unitarian church magazines. But if you look at the poetry, you see that her images, bells and voices and light, are very much like Eliot's. And she laid out again and again in her poems of religious luminaries, she mapped the path between sin and redemption. It was, in a way, Eliot got this blueprint through his mother for the sequence that culminates in faith. I've thought of her in a way like St. Augustine's mother. As you know, St. Augustine converted rather later in life, constantly urged by his mother, who was already a Christian. His first wife, Vivian Haywood, she provided the inferno for Eliot's poetry. And then thirdly, his first love, Emily Hale, who's emerging now into, I think she's going to be extremely important in a way, what those few of us, 4 or 5 of us who are reading us methodically through the letters, feel that Eliot's studies won't be the same once it's all laid out. She was a Bostonian speech and drama teacher and a director of plays, and she also gave very successful readings of poetry, including Eliot's poetry. And Eliot, in his poetry, transforms her into an elevated figure of purity. I'll talk some more about that. Fourthly, there was the brisk, brainy Mary Trevelyan, his church-going companion in the 1940s and early 1950s. And finally, I'm sure you know, his much younger second wife, Valerie Elliot, who brought a restorative forgiveness to his last 8 years. What were these 5 like in actual life? And what did they want, measured against what Eliot made of them in his imagination? How far did they lend themselves to the roles his poetry assigned? Eliot's masks open up the challenge of the hidden life, the centrality of what is unstated, and his poetry often suggests this with spaces, with gaps, with a fragmented text. Eliot, like Henry James, directs us to the gaps and silences, the mystery at the core of lives. Both are skeptical about the kind of outer shell, the chronicle of public events, like, say, the Nobel Prize ceremony that Eliot attended, as Debbie mentioned, in December 1948. He writes in his masterpiece, 4 quartets, in the third of the quartets, The Dry Salvages, he writes a line that has always meant a lot to me as a biographer. Our pasts are covered by the currents of action. Our paths are covered by the currents of action. It's profoundly subversive of traditional biography, often based on public action. And this statement by Eliot has influenced everything I've tried to do. To peel back the visible action, to discern the movements of mind and spirit, this is the challenge of a body of writing that curiously is at once both reserved and confessional. A promising place to start might be a poem Eliot never published, a poem he called Silence, which he wrote while he was still an undergraduate at Harvard. The poem is in a notebook dated June 1910, when he was 21. And it's a moment of sublimity, something that can't be put into words, but later Eliot would speak repeatedly about the importance of what he called unattended moments, as though those were the very core of the life. The most important of those moments creatively for Eliot happened in an English country house garden. Afterwards, Eliot wrote a poem called Bert Norton, the first of the quartets, in 1935, the year he went. And you may know that Eliot did not go to Bert Norton alone. He went with Emily Hale, and this very day, the few of us who are in the archives were emailing back and forth because we're trying to determine exactly the date that Eliot went to Bert Norton. It was, I think we all agreed, the summer or late summer of 1935, but we don't have absolute definite evidence, a lot of peripheral evidence in the letters of that summer. But in that, in this garden, in this Gloucestershire country house, we could say that this garden, not the house but the garden, a very formal garden with box hedges and oblong empty pools, was Eliot's prime site of what he called reality, as distinct from the unreal city of the wasteland. There is, in the garden where he was with Emily Hale, looking down into this pool, an evanescent moment of perfection. And he came to this garden, as I said, with Emily Hale. I should just backtrack and say that in his youth, before he left Boston in 1914, he had been in love with this woman, and hence the line in the poem Bert Norton, "Footfalls echo in the memory, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden." It was an actual rose garden. That's why I'm sort of, in our debates today, I'm plumping for an early September date, because I remember the great Eliot scholar Helen Gardner in her last lectures on Eliot in the 70s saying that it was the roses were in their second blooming. She detected that in the poem, and that would make it early September. This garden is momentarily haunted by the voices of unborn children. Elliot didn't have any children, and he didn't, unfortunately, marry Emily Hale. He did declare himself to her before he left for Europe, and she couldn't return his love at that time. But there are these voices of unborn children hidden excitedly, containing laughter. It's a might have been, in contrast to what has been. What has been was Elliot's rash, impulsive marriage to a very different kind of woman. Soon after he came to England, he came to England to, as a graduate student, to study at Merton College in Oxford, and it was the academic year of 1914-1915. And he married a woman he met, he went out with in Oxford. She was a Londoner, excitable, nervous, smoking, dancing, role-playing Vivian Haywood, whom he barely knew. Well, why marry her, you might well ask. Men of Eliot's generation described her as a woman they wouldn't, well, if they were gentlemen, they wouldn't have introduced her to their mothers. I don't think there was any sense that she was in any way loose, but she was, they thought, actressy and flamboyant and smoking, which Elliot actually found engaging. He hadn't seen women smoke before. But he was key. The important thing, I think, is that he was, of course, attracted to Vivian, but I don't think he was in love with her. He wanted, he said later, he would have liked to lose his virginity. He was 26, and he's very explicit about that in a letter to his to Conrad Aiken, a fellow poet at Harvard. And he would have liked to fling with her, but being a very proper Bostonian, a very moral, upright being, he couldn't do it without marrying her. What really mattered in his marrying Vivian was that she was captivated by his poetry. And this was a crossroads in Eliot's life. He had been studying philosophy at Harvard, as you may know, and he was all set to become an academic philosopher. But he says, even in the letters we're reading now, I would have been a mediocre philosopher. He felt averse to academe. He didn't want to end up in a university, and he didn't actually want to go back to America at that point in his life. And so if he married Vivian, who would not go to America, he was, in effect, cutting himself off from his past. Of course, that wasn't the end of the story, because I might just quote to you something that's coming to my mind, that in a very late interview in 1959, late in his life, he said, my poetry in its sources, in its emotional springs, comes from America, which I think is true, and something he would recognize much later. But at this point, he felt he had to actually break with the wrong narrative. His family, his teachers at Harvard all had his life laid out for him, and he didn't want that life. So he took a terrible risk, because he had to earn a living, and he had to make himself known. He was, at that point, he dried up as a writer of poetry. So it was a very rash moment, especially for a man like Eliot, who was naturally cautious and hesitant. Vivian used to be denigrated when I was a student. It was common to just see her as a burden on Elliot. But when I was a student beginning to write on Elliot, I was very determined to bring her forward and to read her letters, her diary, and the actually very accomplished sketches, quite like Catherine Mansfield's, that she wrote, which Elliot published under pseudonyms in his journal, The Criterion. He thought highly of her writing. She was eloquent. Words obeyed her call. So she was no mean character, except they were just totally unsuited. Totally. And the marriage was simply a disaster from the start. And yet Elliot did feel married to her. He felt duty-bound to support her, and he did so for 18 years. While Vivian, feeling herself unloved, became sicker and sicker and subject to prescribed drugs with which she overdosed from time to time. So she appeared, to use Eliot's phrase in one of his plays, a shivering painted shadow. This was the fraught, hopeless situation when Emily Hale came back into Eliot's life from 1930, when the intimate correspondence here at Princeton began. Could those footfalls in the memory save Elliot if he managed to separate from Vivian? This thought was long in his mind. In his poetic phantasmagoria, he cast Emily Hale as a savior of sorts, a Beatrice figure out of Dante, a, quote, lady of silences, in his most purgatorial poem, Ash Wednesday, which he wrote after his conversion to Anglo-Catholicism in 1927 and completed in 1930, the year, as I said, that his intimate tie with Emily Hale took off. The poem Ash Wednesday is made up of six parts, and the first part that Elliot wrote was called originally Salutation. And in this poem, Salutation, he addresses an unknown woman, not unknown, an unnamed woman, as Lady. The poem begins, Lady. And it's fascinating to see in the letters now Elliot addressing numerous letters to Emily Hale as Lady. In the second letter, in the autumn of 1930, he refers her to specific poems. I was incredibly relieved and excited to see those poems where he identified her as a source. They were poems that I had thought she figured in these poems, but I was taking a terrible risk in suggesting that. But it turns out that one of them was Ash Wednesday, and he says to her that only you will be able to understand this poem. And he also tells her in one of these early letters that his spiritual search had risen out of their meeting again in London. I might mention that in Dante's Vita Nuova, Beatrice appears as, I'm quoting, the lady of the Salutation. So there was a very medieval sense behind Eliot's love of Emily Hale. It was a kind of love that you would find in Dante. And I remember a slightly awkward moment in my defense of my dissertation at Columbia, where quite reasonably the examiners asked me where I would place Eliot. I think they thought I was going to say, easy answer, modernism. But actually I said, well, in the medieval period. And there was a kind of slightly shocked silence. But this is what they actually were very amiable and didn't take that up. I've long seen Emily Hale as central to Eliot's life, and when I came here to Princeton in 1972, when I was finishing my dissertation, I came to speak to Walt Litz, the chair of the English department, because he was bringing out a book called Elliot in His Time. It was a selection of essays by the luminaries of that time, including Helen Gardner and Grover Smith, and it was a book about responses to the Wasteland manuscript, which Valerie Elliot had edited and had recently been published. And as we were walking across this Princeton campus, he told me about this huge cache of Eliot letters in Firestone Library. They were thought to be in 12 boxes, now it turns out to be 14 boxes. And Walt said to me, he confided a fantasy. I thought it a very Henry Jamesian kind of fantasy. He said, if I had cancer and I knew I was going to die, I would creep into the archives and cut the steel bands and read those letters for my life's last pleasure. I've never forgotten that fantasy. And then and there, I was still a young woman, I made up my mind that I was definitely going to live to this day. I hope then to fill out the crucial bond, though of course it will remain somewhat mysterious, which Elliot kept, a bond that Elliot kept mostly under wraps, and which after decades he discarded in 1956, preceding his second marriage in January 1957. I don't intend to write about Elliot and Emily Hale alone. Their love was interwoven with his other relationships, especially with Vivian Haywood. But my provisional title, Elliot Among the Women, is a play on Eliot's alternative title for his first great poem. That title was Prufrock Among the Women. The newly released love letters convey how Elliot drew Emily Hale into the course of his actual and poetic life, that sequence that culminates in faith. He felt her to be a spiritual person. He says to her in one of the early letters, I recognize the spirit when I see it. And as I said, he tells her that meeting her in London set his spiritual development going. In the winter of 1932-33, he visited Emily Hale, where she was teaching at Scripps College, and he crossed the continent to see her over New Year 1933. And then at the end of the next academic year, in the summer of 1934, she took leave of absence, and she crossed the continent in turn to sail to England. And at that point, she had Eliot's ring, as the letters prove. She remained until the end of 1935, and all the while she was close at hand, intermittently in Chipping Campden in the Cotswolds, where her aunt and uncle took a house, and in London. Elliot stood then at another crossroad. He had separated from his first wife, Vivian, in the summer of 1933, and in the second half of 1935, when he walked from Chipping Campden to Burnt Norton, his spirit lifted. This possibility of happiness came before him in the Rose Garden moment, a moment he calls in and out of time. In another manuscript, he calls it a matchless moment. And the question is, could it become an enduring, quote, reality, or must it remain a recovered memory, evanescent in the present and future? So what happens is that they are at this, they walk through a kind of aisle. It's almost like a marriage aisle of roses. Everything in the garden is very much as it always was. I've been there about 3 or 4 times. It's always the same. And there's the rose garden and the box hedge, and you walk through the rose garden towards 2 great empty pools. But Elliot writes as though there's only one pool. It's actually an enormous pool. It is brown-edged, and because of the climate in England, I'm feeling very conscious here in Princeton how beautifully clear and dry the air is. Because in England it's very cloudy and the light is going in and out all the time. And I think there was a ray of sunshine hitting the empty pool, so that there was the optical illusion that the pool was filled with water out of sunlight, and the lotus rose quietly, and the surface glittered out of heart of light. Go, said the bird, go, go, go. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. So there it is, the word reality, which is this challenge. How is he to hold on to reality in some permanent way? Virginia Woolf's diary. Virginia Woolf was Eliot's early publisher at the Hogarth Press. She published The Wasteland, and she became a lifelong friend. And in her diary, she detects when Elliot visits her on the 21st of November, 1934, she sees him as, quote, riven. She sees some divided being, and in an extraordinary way, she intuited the course of his writing in this particular diary entry. His plays, she sees the course his plays would take. And as an agnostic, Virginia Woolf resists it. She writes in her diary defiantly, I can't be frozen off with this divine authority any longer. So what she's saying, I won't be frozen off. She's intuiting something that happens some years later in the second of Eliot's quartets, East Kirker, where he talks about the frieze ascends from feet to knees. He chooses the path of asceticism. It's the path that doesn't include Emily Hale. It doesn't include the Rose Garden. And somehow Virginia Woolf, she was extraordinarily prescient in that particular diary entry. And so she provides a comparison with Emily Hale. She is immersed in her Bloomsbury values, which put friendship before belief or ideology. Only connect, you'll remember from Ian Forster. And I think that we have to see Eliot somewhere in 1935 or so on that shifting, mysterious ground where he has yet to test his capacity for spiritual transformation. I think for a long time he isn't sure if he has it in him. Vivian, his wife, with her swift hatred and lashing words, was a reflection of what disturbed Elliot in his own nature. He was, Virginia Woolf saw, thrown like an assegai into the hide of the world. This seems to fit his confessions to Emily Hale of violent temper. The violence of his feeling was controlled always. He actually boasts to Emily Hale that although he has a violent temper, he's adept at controlling it. It was controlled by the perfection of his manners, and this violence appears in his early poetry as disgust with intellectual pretension, with rotting cities, I'm afraid with Jews, and with women as the enemy of the absolute. This fallen world Eliot transmutes into the wasteland's vision of hell, of which Vivian, with her anarchic abandon, was arch-embodiment. After Eliot left her, she said he had made her feel, I'm quoting, a sort of super being. His poetry displays her in powerful, doomed roles like the Duchess of Malfi or Cleopatra, or, as he calls it, the Lady of Situations, conspicuously vocal compared with the ideal Lady of Silences. Eliot wrote to his friend Conrad Aiken in 1914, I am very dependent on women, and I could expand on that, why he was dependent on women in terms of his home life. He needed to feel the actual on the pulse in order to propel the poetic phantasmagoria. And while writing the last and climactic quartet, Little Gidding, Eliot did 18 drafts of this poem, so he was struggling. He told his friend John Hayward that he needed personal memory working well below the surface. We feel this in his 1929 essay on Dante. At a time when he was writing Ash Wednesday, there is a commitment to his own psychic journey through hell and purgatory. And it was in climbing the purgatorial stair of Ash Wednesday and in writing his play, The Family Reunion, a play about a guilt-ridden man whose wife has unaccountably fallen overboard, that Vivian Elliot, who belongs in an inferno, shifts off stage. She was put in an asylum and she ended her life there. And this action in the playwright's life coincides with the last draft of his play. Both happened at more or less at the same time in 1938. So we might say with Henry James, art makes life. The third woman, Mary Trevelyan, was very different from the other two I've spoken about. This was a public friendship. She was Elliot's companion and prop for 20 years, from the time that Vivian entered the asylum in 1938 until Elliot's marriage in 1957. She was a splendidly vigorous, sensible English woman of the Florence Nightingale caring type. She was a dauntless traveller who read Mary Kingsley's Travels in West Africa aloud to Elliot, and she left a still unpublished but highly intelligent and readable memoir of her friendship with Elliot, boswellizing their conversations in the late 40s and early 50s. She appears as the acknowledged model for Julia, the bossy guardian, comic figure in Elliot's Cocktail Party, which, as Debbie said, he wrote here at Princeton in 1948. Then there was finally Valerie Elliot, the source for the loyal moniker in Elliot's last play, The Elder Statesman, which was written during their courtship and the first year of their marriage. And both Valerie Elliot and Monica brought relief, forgiveness, a return to simplicity of heart to an old man who has become hollow-hearted. She's the recipient, Valerie, of a poem, A Dedication to My Wife, which was published in the last collected poems of Eliot's lifetime in 1963, and it was very startling to people because it was a poem celebrating the physicality of marital love. There were 3 more poems of marital love, all startling to people when they were published finally in 2015, not very long ago, in the new annotated collection of Eliot's poems. People who had looked on Eliot as austere, reticent, were surprised because in the well-known poems, there is disgust with the flesh. In his first debate between body and soul, he is disgusted with defecation and masturbation. In Sweeney Erect, sex is associated with the jolts of an epileptic attack. And in the drafts of The Wasteland, the clerk and typist couple like crawling bugs. So he had a very disgusted feeling about physical love. And yet here in these marital poems, we see a very different Eliot. It is of a piece with the dedication to his second wife. And he speaks of, in this dedication, of sleeping lovers whose bodies smell of each other. In the same way, a poem called Sleeping Together, another called How the Tall Girl and I Play Together, and How the Tall Girl's Breasts Are, confirm a firm physical love on the basis of trust and commitment. Fair copies of these poems are said to survive in what's called Valerie's own book. Eliot's poems have an awakened freshness, as though for the first time he observes a woman's body as a thing of beauty. But it must be said that as poetry, this can't compare with the eloquence of John Donne's lover, whose roving hands, licensed to go before, behind, between, above, below, are likened to voyagers of discovery. Oh, my America, my Newfoundland. Eliot's simplicity is charming when he repeats, I love a tall girl, and also the tenderness when he strokes his wife's back and long white legs. Explicitness, though, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, is less erotic than suggestion. It's no match, I think, for the great love poems of the past, the overwhelming theatricality, say, of Yeats's lover with his mask of burning gold and emerald eyes. And no match, in fact, for Eliot's earlier memory in the wasteland of love, of blood shaking the heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender that he identifies for Emily Hale as for her. Eliot's words of love were designed to please his wife and to sustain her through her life without him. But for readers, they are meant, I think, as a sign of sort, a sign of the grace that came to Eliot unexpectedly through human love. He had expected to win grace through asceticism, but as it turned out, it was physical, erotic love that gave him this feeling in the last 8 years of his life. And he lays out the pattern for this finale in a British Council pamphlet on George Herbert, perhaps the last criticism he ever published, in 1962. It's a spiritual biography in which Eliot seems to speak in unison with a 17th century poet who, like Eliot, was moody, snobbish, meticulous of dress, and who turned aside from the world. Like Eliot, after suffering divine absence, Herbert had a happy marriage in the last years of his life, and Eliot closes this pamphlet by quoting in full the poem Love 3 by Herbert, beginning, "Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat." To Eliot, the life of a man of genius viewed in relation to his writing, I'm quoting, comes to take a pattern of inevitability, and even his disabilities will seem to have stood him in good stead. If we apply this to his own life, its inner coherence is obvious, particularly clear in his relations with women. It is curious to see how women were absorbed into an almost predetermined pattern. His poetry transforms them as allegorical figures who represent extremes of vision and horror, and who take Eliot where he wished to be, on the frontiers of consciousness, that's his phrase, staring into the wasteland's heart of darkness, or into Burnt Norton's heart of light. Thank you. Thank you.